mynews.studio.
A third of the world's countries have just pledged to phase out fossil fuels. But if you look out at the North Sea, oil rigs are still everywhere. Why is that?
Today's date is November 28th, 2025. COP30 in Brazil wrapped up just a few days ago, and honestly, what stood out was less what was achieved and more what wasn't. Despite a push from over 80 countries, there was no explicit agreement to phase out fossil fuels in the final declaration. Doesn't that seem like a major gap between what's needed and what actually happened?
It really is, but here's where it gets interesting. As COP30 was closing, Colombia and the Netherlands announced a new international coalition to phase out fossil fuels. And they're not alone. They've brought 22 other countries with them, including the UK. The UK is actually the first major economy to stop approving new oil and gas exploration in the North Sea. That's more than just a statement. It's a real policy shift.
So even though the official negotiations stalled, this group is moving forward on their own. But what exactly are they planning? Do we know?
Their main focus right now is something called the International Conference on the Just Transition Away from Fossil Fuels. It's scheduled for April 2026 in Colombia. The goal is to work out actual steps to move from coal, oil, and gas to cleaner energy.
Wait, so it's not only about emissions cuts?
Right. It's also about making sure workers and communities that depend on fossil fuels aren't abandoned during the transition.
That connects to the BLM action mechanism, doesn't it? It's supposed to make the transition fair, especially for countries that rely on oil and gas for jobs and income. But do we have any idea how they'll manage that in practice?
That part is still being worked out. The BLM action mechanism lays down a framework, but there's a funding gap. Wealthier countries haven't yet committed the resources needed to help countries in the global south shift away from fossil fuels. The hope is that the 2026 conference will bring more solid financial support.
Funding always seems to be the stumbling block. They also announced the Global Implementation Accelerator and something called the Journey Fund to attract investment. But without binding commitments, isn't there a risk it all stays voluntary?
Exactly. The accountability here depends on voluntary pledges and reputational pressure, not legal requirements. The coalition will report progress at COP31 in Turkey, but if members fall behind, there's no enforcement mechanism.
So, if there's no legal force, what's the real significance here? Is this just more statements, or is it something different?
It does matter, because it shows a shift. Instead of waiting for everyone to agree, some countries are just moving ahead. About a third of the world's nations are taking action, and that can influence markets and send signals to investors and companies.
Let's look at the numbers. Fossil fuel production is set to surpass what the Paris Agreement allows by more than 120% in 2030. By 2050, it could be 4.5 times higher than what's needed to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. How does this coalition plan to close that gap?
They're aiming to set minimum standards for what a just transition looks like, align public and private investment, and build on a recent International Court of Justice ruling that says states have a legal duty to protect the climate. Plus, they're looking at examples like the EU's methane regulations, which use things like market access and penalties to cut emissions.
But do these strategies work everywhere? I mean, the daily life of a coal miner in Colombia or an oil worker in Nigeria is very different from a policymaker sitting in the Netherlands.
That's exactly why the 2026 conference is so important. It's meant to bring together not just governments, but also indigenous peoples, workers, civil society groups, and industry. The aim is to find practical, fair solutions that work in different places.
And then there's the issue of stranded assets, fossil fuel infrastructure that could lose all value as the world shifts to renewables. How are countries preparing for that?
It's a real concern. The coalition wants to coordinate the transition to avoid sudden disruptions, phasing out production in a way that gives regions time to develop new industries and jobs. But without clear funding and planning, some areas could still face economic shocks.
So we have a coalition, a framework, and some funding tools, but no legal leverage. What's actually going to drive countries to follow through?
Reputation, public attention, and market dynamics. As more countries join and show progress, the expectation increases for others to take action too. And since investors are watching, momentum can drive capital in new directions.
We're already seeing some of that, right? Utilities are putting billions into the energy transition, new alliances are forming, and energy efficiency plans are being rolled out. Is this a tipping point?
The pace is definitely picking up, even as formal UN talks slow down. The coalition steps are setting examples that others might follow. The upcoming conference will be a real test of whether this approach leads to measurable change.
One last thought. Could this coalition approach become the new way climate policy gets made? Groups move first, and others catch up over time.
It could. With consensus harder to reach, smaller groups can act more quickly. The main challenge will be making sure no one falls through the cracks as the world's energy systems change.
So, with the Santa Marta Conference in 2026 on the horizon, we're left with two big questions. Can this coalition deliver a fair, workable roadmap for phasing out fossil fuels? And will the rest of the world follow?
That's what we'll be watching. Thanks for joining us as we unpacked the momentum and open questions around the global phase-out of fossil fuels.
We covered how the coalition formed, their goals for a just transition, the funding gaps, and the shift from waiting for consensus to moving through coalitions. The next year will show if these efforts can turn into real change.
Thanks for listening. This episode was brought to you by mynews.studio. Try it now for free.